very much, Martin. And may I just again say what a pleasure it is to be with friends again. It's always a pleasure to speak to Wias, and I think it's the first time I've done it via Zoom. So do forgive me for the slight nuts and bolts of it. You know, as a museum curator, I'm used to the technology of the past, and occasionally modern technology does defeat me, but I think we now have the full screen. If somebody like Martin or Victor could give me a thumbs up if we're all there, that's great. Thank you very much. So this evening, stepping into the breach, as you say, Martin, quite correctly, I do usually sometimes try to have a theme of something to do with Warwickshire within it, within the presentation, although quite often we've talked about other things like water supply in London, pumping engines, West Africa and all sorts. And this evening there is no exception. There is a Warwickshire connection with this. Well, you would expect that from myself. So what we're going to do over the next hour is have a look at the exhibition that we mounted at the National Railway Museum, and it is the National Railway Museum. I won't start on that hobby horse this evening, but Railway Museum is a branding exercise. It still says National Railway Museum over the door. It still says it on my business card, on the address, and on the National Heritage Act. But Brass, Steel and Fire was conceived as a century of model trains, a century of model engineering, and a celebration of model making. And it ran from 2019, from September 2019 until August 2021, both at York and the Science Museum in London. Some of you I know got to see it. Some of you I know would have liked to have get to see it, and unfortunately, you know, the pandemic happened, and certainly, you know, quite a lot of us didn't see much of it at all. I wasn't even sure if I would see it myself in London until very late on in the day, but we'll get through that. And what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do, was celebrate the model locomotive, the steam model engine, but not in a way that we're looking at, you might say, you know, with a century of model trains, we might be talking about, you know, Hornby or Lima or any Graham Farish, some of those big names that you might watch on television before you're watching Tim Dunn or before Bangers and Cash. But no, what we're looking at this evening is why, who, where, what model locomotives. The first century, as the first model steam locomotive is around 1810, and I've somewhat arbitrarily drew the line in what we included in the exhibition at 1910, just as what you might term the really popular period of model engineering comes in, with people like Bassett Loke, Henry Greenlee, LBSC, and various other names. It's not to say that model engineering wasn't around and wasn't popular, but this is before widespread selling of castings and drawings, when people really had to make everything for themselves. So I subtitle it From Experiment to Exhibition, because of course, you know, 1810, the steam locomotive is in its infancy, and it's where I fried several colleagues' minds by trying to make the definition, the separation between a model locomotive and a locomotive model, because of course 1810 there aren't really many locomotives to make a model of, so you are actually making concept models to try out ideas, to try out technology, to try out engineering before you cut metal in a large scale and find out whether it works or not. But by the end of the period, we are also looking at engines that are made for exhibition, made for pleasure, made for display. So the exhibition itself was to examine the what, the why, the where and the when, and actually the who. And I wanted it to be more than serried ranks of steam locomotive models. You know, we could have put any number of engines in cases, and lined them all alongside each other with little labels that said what they were and who made them. And yeah, that would have worked. But I wanted to get more into the people who'd made them, why they'd made them, where they'd made them, and when. So the locomotive there on the right, that was in the collection of the British Engineerium for many years down in Brighton and Hove. And it was bought on the Portobello Road by the late Dr. Jonathan Minns in the 1960s in a wooden box that said it was based on Timothy Hackworth's Sanspareil. Now, if you're into railway history at all, you'll immediately say that bears no resemblance to Sanspareil whatsoever. And that's exactly because it isn't. And my Former colleague Jim Rees did a lot of work on this engine, including having it 3D scanned and X-rayed, and interrogating the pollen that was within the boiler from its exhibition period. It went to the Department of Materials at Oxford for analysis, and we now think that it was made by a northeastern clockmaker to provide the concept of a twin-cylindered steam vehicle, a steam locomotive, for William Hedley, and we'll maybe move on to that as we go on this evening, if I remember. But that engine itself is around 1808, 1810, so it's probably the oldest locomotive model in the world. But we'll go through a lot more of that as we go through the evening. And we looked at three basic themes of what models were made for. They were made for experimentation, like I was saying, to try out ideas, to try out technology, to try concepts, sometimes to fail. They were made for pleasure, and whether that was the pleasure of making or the pleasure of operating them or playing with them, or just the pleasure of having them in the library of a gentleman. And that's another reason for having them. Of course, the other way of having a model is to sell ideas, to sell your wares. Locomotive manufacturers built models. They took them across the world and said, look, this is what you could have. And the headlamp and buffer in the front end on the right are from an Egyptian a model made in the UK for the Egyptian market, again, to show exactly the quality of UK engineering that would be available to the Egyptian railways. But I wanted it to be more than just locomotives. As I say, if it had been serried ranks of engines in cases, we'd have had a very specialized audience. It would have been a great thing to do, but I wanted to make it an exhibition that would connect our general visitor with the collection. There hasn't been, as far as I'm aware, and people may correct me later on, there hasn't been an exhibition solely based on model locomotives for many years, if ever. There are displays of them, there's exhibitions of them, in terms of, they support other bits, or they form sections of museums and displays, and you'll see again some of those as we go through this evening. But there's not really been anything that's looked at the model locomotive as a phenomenon, as something that happened. And likewise, there hadn't been anything written. In fact, there still hasn't been anything really written researching the model locomotive since the late Jonathan Minns wrote his book Model Steam Locomotives in the year before I was born. So that's pushing 5 decades nearly now, and perhaps I will get to write the book after all the research that was done for this. So we looked at people, and in terms of people, that's from Nottingham lace maker, from coal miners, from teenagers doing things in their spare rooms, through to folks who are starting off with an engineering apprenticeship and making a locomotive as an apprentice piece, or an established engineer saying, well, hang on a minute, I've got to show my backers that this thing works, or doesn't, as the case may be. We have in the exhibition a model of the Arthur Parsi compressed air locomotive, which Arthur Parsi developed. He took a patent out on it, and he took it to the promoters and the directors of the Great Western Railway. And I believe what the teenagers say now is the director of the Great Western Railway basically said meh to him, and he went off and patented it in the US. Whilst he didn't become a rich man, compressed air locomotives didn't really take off in the British Isles, but they did find employment in the mines, particularly the coal mines of North America. So whilst Arthur Parsi wasn't hiding to nothing with the Great Western Railway, the USA was his haven. And we looked at the same pioneers, people who were pushing the boundaries. We'll maybe look at William Hedley and what he was doing, trying out the concept of coupling wheels together so that a steam locomotive wasn't just driving one set of wheels, but through a set of gears or rods, it could drive two, and it could double the traction and the power that it was able to put on the track. I wanted to look at the places. Not everybody building models was doing them in well-equipped workshops. They weren't necessarily making models in on lathes. A lot of stuff was fabricated and things made by hand, because we wanted to also inspire. And Martin, you were saying earlier that you know, the modelling bug has never really hit you. We wanted to make this contemporary as well, so we included hands-on. There was a hands-on lathe, a foot lathe in the exhibition, some hand tools, castings and pieces of a locomotive, but also some wonderful quotes. I had a book from about 1904, The Young Engineer, and the second chapter was about setting up a workshop at home. And bear in mind, this is for children and teenagers, and it goes on and said, you know, if you have a lean-to or an outdoor shed, and perhaps you can put your workshop in there. And then it said, if you do not have this room set aside, you can still set up a workshop in the parlour. However, be careful to remove the oil from the tablecloth, otherwise you will incur the vexation of the maid. And I thought that was splendid. So, you know, we wanted to look at the domestic space. You know, these engines were made everywhere, whether it was in a workshop or in an attic or spare room or on the table, dropping oil on the tablecloth. And looking at the products, some of the people who made the engines went on to build full-size locos. Sometimes they were made by manufacturers who made other materials as well. And you'll see there on the right an advert for Chadburns of Sheffield, who made various instruments. You can see on there the advert from them, which is in the Science Museum collection. Barometers and dividers, busts, ships, globes, microscopes, telescopes, and all that sort of thing. And then, of course, there's a beam engine, and then right at the front, a model locomotive and carriage. So, you know, these are mid-19th century companies who are showing their prowess at making things. They're showing and showcasing their products, of which some happened to be steam engines. So you end up with places like Stevens Model Dockyard, Clyde Model Dockyard, Chadburns, and a few others that we'll cross as we go through this evening. And I also wanted it to use supporting objects from within our collection and elsewhere. So we did bring in tools, we've brought in instruments and images. Chadburns were optical people. We brought in some glasses from Negretti and Zambra, who were also optical instrument makers and opticians, but also sold steam locomotive models, and we'll move on to them shortly. But it was an incredible thing to be asked to do, because it was like going on supermarket sweep, but for 19th century steam engines. And we knew about some of the models in public collections within the UK. We knew about our own model collection at York and within the Science Museum down in London. And we worked with a couple of specialists within Britain who were either dealers or agents for collectors and museums across the world. And so this is the most amazing collection that I've ever been to, and I mean that, ever been to, in Istanbul in Turkey. If anyone has been to Istanbul, and even if you haven't and you find yourself in that position, this is the Rami Koç Museum in the former naval dockyard in Istanbul. Now, Rami Koç, you might say, who's he? But a lot of you will have come across Grundig sound systems and Beko freezers and other domestic appliances. Well, the KO at the end of Beko stands for Koç, and that is Rami Koç and his empire. The Koç Holdings also own the former Ford Transit factory at Eastleigh now in Hampshire. They own hotels, they own shipbuilders, they own dockyards, and Rami Koç's basic turnover accounts for 9% of the Turkish GDP annually. But the guy is an industrial and steam enthusiast and transport enthusiast. He has an ocean-going launch. He has various steam tugs. He has a former USS submarine in his museum. He has the Admiral's barge from HMS Hood, which survived, amongst other things. Huge collection, and pretty much if something has come up for sale at Bonhams or Christie's in the last 40 years, his man sits in the corner with his hand up until he's managed to buy it. And so what you see there on the right is the locomotive model hall at the Rami Koç Museum in Istanbul. And pretty much, like I was saying, the contents are there, furnished from the catalogues of Christie's and Bonhams in the last 4 decades. Koç was advised by Jonathan Minns in the creation of the museum, but of course then has added to his own taste. And pretty much this book of Jonathan Minns is, I've seen pretty much every locomotive model that was in this book in the 70s, because they're either in private collections or in institutions around the world. So a lovely array of things to choose from, things to look at. And I did select this engine on the left, which is an incredible thing. Some of you you'll be familiar with the Ransoms firm of Ipswich, either Ransoms and Head, Ransom Sims and Head, Ransoms Head and Jeffries, Ransom Sims and Jeffries, famous for making lawnmowers and turntables and railway cranes and the occasional traction engine or 3. But this is a garden locomotive made, it's based on a broad gauge engine, but it was made by Ransoms and Sims in the 1840s. It's 18-inch gauge. It's one of the largest garden locomotives in existence. And it left the UK about 30 years ago. We brought it back for the London leg of the exhibition, because this whole process of international loans taught us a lot about international diplomacy, but also about paperwork and systems. And whilst the museum were very, very keen to lend it to us, the Turkish bureaucracy defeated us for about 12 months. So whilst this engine wasn't able to join us in York, which was a great shame, we managed to have it for about 4 weeks in London before the pandemic closed the Science Museum in the autumn of 2020. And then, unfortunately, when the Science Museum reopened in 2021, the model had to go back to Turkey, because otherwise we'd have incurred various export and customs problems and costs. So a real shame, but we managed to get it back for a month publicly, which there we go. But yes, at times it was like shopping for steam. You know, I could have gone round with a credit card and merrily, absolutely bankrupted myself. Another superb collection here. This is the Robert Guinness Steam Museum at Strafan in County Kildare, about 15 miles from Dublin. Amazing day trip. I took off from Newcastle Airport. Half an hour later, I'm landing in Dublin, put into Robert Guinness's Jaguar, and within a matter of minutes into this former chapel. You know, we talk about all sorts of interesting things in this. And yes, as Martin said, I've been interested in steam for a long time, but that moves on to an interest in buildings, an interest in architecture, and also the reuse of buildings. So we were talking about that the chimney earlier, and the buildings within Leamington. It's interesting to see how things are done. And so the Robert Guinness Steam Museum, and yes, he is part of the Guinness family. The Robert Guinness Steam Museum is housed in the former Railway Works Church from Inchicore. So the Great Southern Railway of Ireland had a works at there is still a CIE works at Inchicore, and to look after the men's spiritual needs, they built a church. In the 80s, the church was redundant. Robert Guinness bought the church and moved it block by block into the grounds of his house in Strafan. And this is one side of the church. What you can't see to the right behind the wall is the main nave of the church, which has probably 7 or 8 full-size stationary steam engines in it, including a triple expansion pumping engine, beam engine, and various other bits and pieces. So a superb museum, a superb collection. Robert's father assembled these locomotives in 1930s and 1940s. He offered them to the Science Museum in about 1949. And the Science Museum said, no, we only want 1 or 2 of them. So he said, no, you're not having them. Passed them on to his son in the 70s. And Robert has created this wonderful museum, which also has the most beautiful gardens. So see it in April, May, June time. I went in the June. I could have spent as long in the gardens as I did in the museum. Beautiful surroundings, very welcoming people. And incredibly, the museum attracts only 15,000 people a year, which is absolutely stunning when you look at the quality of it and how close it is to Dublin. But nonetheless, superb models, wonderful things to be able to have the privilege of seeing, and also go around with my shopping cart, as it were, my shopping trolley. And yes, we'll see a couple of engines that we selected from there as we'll go. In fact, here is one. So you look at, you know, a room of 45 engines. How do you choose them? And we talked about how I wanted to tell stories and I wanted to look at people. And you know, I've seen a lot of these engines, these Stirling singles. There's a lot of them were made in the 19th century. The original engine was made in 1870, the class, and they were the East Coast mainline high flyers, very high speed, 8-foot driving wheels, and really, you know, the cutting edge technology of the time. So it's clear that people will make models of them. So how do you choose which Stirling single to put in the exhibition? Just another one? I must have seen 6 or 7. That's how you choose them. You look at see who made them. H.J. Wood, maker, 185 Oxford Street, London. So what, you may say? Who is this H.J. Wood? Well, you might not have heard of him, but you'll have heard of his son, Sir Henry Wood, father of the Proms. His dad made steam engines for a living. And amongst all of these, not this one particularly, but I have actually seen Sir Henry Wood's own steam-powered train set, which was an amazing thing. I'd have liked to have had it in, but like I say, space was finite. But this is the story. These are the stories of people who made them. And Henry Wood set up in Oxford Street. He was initially an instrument maker, optical instrument maker, and scientific instrument maker, but he specialized latterly in steam engines. He made quite a number of Stirling singles, but he also made other locomotives and stationary engines as well. And I just thought it was a lovely, lovely connection, because every time I sit there and watch Last Night of the Proms now, and they put the wreath round Sir Henry, I sometimes think they ought to put a Stirling single at the foot of him as well. Well, we learned about the technology of these engines. We said about the playing with them, the using of them, the operation of them, the enjoyment and the playfulness. And these are a lot of them are used in domestic environments. And I'd heard and read about an engine that was powered by a hot bar, but I'd not actually seen it. So it's very difficult to make a coal-fired steam engine at this scale that works, or certainly it would be for unskilled people in a domestic environment. And a lot of engines were, the steam was made by methylated spirits. Those of you who remember the Mammoths from the 50s, 60s and 70s, until those horrible white pellets came in, will remember fondly the smell of methylated spirits, maybe less fondly the scolding of your mother as the thing ran across the bedroom floor, dropping blue flame behind it. But not everybody had that or wanted to use that in the domestic environment. So this engine was made by Chesterman and Bottom of Sheffield around the 1850s, 1855, and it's a hot bar locomotive. So what you can see in the bottom left picture is one of our, this is actually one of our collector friends who helps us, Tim Armitage in Nantwich, and he has in his hand the hot bar. So that hot bar would be put into your fire or put into your range and heated until it was pretty much red hot. Then with a set of tongs, you slotted it into the locomotive boiler underneath, and there it was. It went in there and it boiled the water, and the engine ran around your garden or your floor until the steam ran out or the water ran out. But of course, because there was no fire in it, you had no flame, so you had no risk of damage to the boiler when the water ran out. I said about running around on the floor. You'll see on the right, this is a feature of these floor locomotives, that the wheels are set or can be set at an angle. So you can run them on track, and you could buy tracks from Stevens Model Dockyard and others. But on this occasion, you could angle the wheels so that it could run round and round in circles on the floor. And that's assuming you had a pretty large parlour, to be honest. I mentioned the maker of this engine, Chesterman and Bottom of Sheffield. They became Raybone Chesterman, who I can remember Dad buying spirit levels and tape measures that were Raybone Chesterman. I think they're now part of the Stanley enterprise. They wanted to buy this engine off Mr. Armitage, and he said, no, I'm keeping it for myself because it's far too nice. we were finding that people were also, these engines, they're fanciful. They're not necessarily anything based in reality. But you say, the Stirling single, then you've got something fanciful and freelance. But then we end up with more faithful replicas, and this is another way of people making model engines. They're making them to be as close replicas as they can to the real thing. This one is in the collection of the Society of Model and Experimental Engineers, based in London. Another superb collection. Actually, I mean, it's a wonderful facility that they have, SME, and their archivist Anne Hatherill, one of the earliest, not the earliest, but one of the few known lady model engineers from the 50s, other than Cherry Hill. She is their archivist and helped immensely with a lot of documentation and paperwork. And this is our link this evening with Warwickshire, because this is Mr. Thomas Averill of Ulster's engine. It's a Midland compound from the Midland Railway, cutting edge technology at the time. Number 2631 ended up as number 1000, which is part of the National Collection, but it doesn't quite look like this. Mr. Averill was a banker in Ulster, but he was good friends with the men at the local loco sheds, both Midland and Great Western, and they helped him making the measurements to get his models exactly as they were. And there's a photograph in the SME archive, not of this engine, but of Mr. Averill at it's not Ulster, but it's another one of the sheds in that area, with his model on a stand in front of him. He also experimented with steam cars, and perhaps a figure for a talk another evening. I'm not offering to do that for maybe 2 or 3 years until I've maybe researched him a little more, but I think it's fantastic, again, from myself as a Warwickshire lad, to see how the spread of the interest extends into our home county, which is wonderful. Oh, look, another Stirling single. This one is in a private collection near Harrogate, and this actually is the one that we chose to put in the exhibition, because it's another Sir Henry Wood engine. It's another Henry Wood engine made by Sir Henry's father, but its brass plate on the side says Negretti and Zambra. Now, I've mentioned them already as being optical instrument makers and opticians. We have Negretti and Zambra instruments in the Science Museum collection, as well as Negretti and Zambra spectacles. So I thought if we had this, then we could put it alongside on display alongside the other products of the firm, and make the links and the connections that way, which is what we did. In the same gentleman's collection, here's a model made for the sheer pleasure of model making, and this one didn't make it into the exhibition, but it's a 1880s model stationary engine and locomotive type boiler made by a gentleman who was employed at Ashford Railway Works down in Kent, and they had exhibitions of work to show off their craftsmanship. And so this model's in this collection in Yorkshire, but you can see on the rear of its display case the certificate that it was awarded at one of the Ashford shows in the late 19th century. And so we come across that phenomenon of showing off your skill as a model engineer to many people. And Shildon, where I'm sitting now, there was quite a large community of model makers and model engineers within County Durham. There was a bit of a dissenting C of E vicar who wrote a book, Model Steam Engines, The Story of a Clergyman's Hobby, available from the Foss down the road, TEE Publishing, under a tenner. It's a superb 1910 contemporary account of model engineering as this chap saw it. He wasn't a particularly great model engineer himself. He basically talks about polishing his models and improving them, and then running them on compressed air and upsetting his wife with the big oil engine in the basement. But it's worth it for that. But he also has a really interesting chapter about some notable model engineers, and he talks about folks in Darlington, in Shildon, in Bishop Auckland, in Hunwick, in Crook, in Durham, all these folks making engines, and he's actually using them almost as a sermon on temperance, but you know, the devil finds work for idle hands in the alehouse, so go and make a steam engine. But he also talks about some of these major shows, and the Shildon Industrial and Agricultural Show, which happened once a year. And I have to thank my mum, Janet, for this. She found with the British newspapers online, this show where these model engines were being shown ran for about 25 years in Shildon, and it was attracting about 12,000 people in a day to see it, which is more than the population of the town. And these are people coming to a field near the parish church to look at tents full of produce and engines. Absolutely amazing. Some other stunning things that we couldn't necessarily have space to put in because the case for this would have been enormous. In around 1890, one of the Bank of England, I think it was one of the Bank of England employees, one of the, I can't remember if he was governor or not, but he set to and commissioned what was then called the £10,000 model railway. And it featured in various publications of the time, the Railway Magazine, the Locomotive, and other publications about how this was perfect in every detail. It's a London North Western Railway 440, but the layout that went with it was stunning. It was, I think, it had its own room, the size of a billiard room, made for it specially. And I might see if I can scan a couple of pictures and send them across for sharing via the internet. But this is what's left of it, the engine and maybe 4 or 5 carriages. But you can see once more on the right, the carriages are absolutely superb. Yes, they're not fine detail as we would expect them, used to stuff that's made to the nth degree of precision. But you can see here all the luggage rack is complete, the blinds on the window, the maquette on the seating, but also the door locks and the handles. They all work and they all shut and they're all wonderful. And in the brake van, there's even underneath the guards compartment, there's a dog box for people traveling their hounds. And there, I can see a dog joining us on the picture there. And that's very appropriate, but I don't think he'd fit in this either. But this is an enormous model loco. You can see the size of the table that it's on. And can you imagine that running around a billiard room on the side of your house? Well, I think I'd give up my house to have a billiard room like that. But this is perhaps the ultimate. And the exhibition was supported by a generous benefactor in Harrogate itself, and this is his lounge in his house, and it's terrible, really. He said, I don't watch television in the evening. He said, I come in here with a glass of port and I sit there with my feet up and I smile. Well, I mean, how could you not when you're looking at this amazing collection? And it was quite something, because I went into his house and he said, right, you can borrow anything. So I said, okay, how about that, and that? And he said, except those. You can't borrow those engines. So we talked about Chadburn of Sheffield earlier. Behind this locomotion model here, this is a Chadburn engine of Sheffield. It's called Prince Albert. It was really rather splendid. Here's another. This is the engine in the foreground is an 1875 contemporary of Northeastern Railway locomotive running up and down the East Coast Main Line right then. So once again, cutting edge technology. I wasn't allowed to borrow that either. But to be fair, John was very generous, and we'll look at some of what he lent us later. He also has engines that were in the ownership of the late Brian Goodchild, somebody else who some of you will know of from the Leamington and Warwick rail and transport and industry scene from a number of decades ago. But we've gone through the shopping. We've gone and created an exhibition. I've gone and written the words, I've written the text, we've put everything together, we've pulled all the engines, and there it is. This is Brass, Steel and Fire as it opened in September 2019, with its various areas looking at why the models were made, who made them, and the effect of it. And I won't go into it now because I know that time is passing, but you can see that this is pre-COVID, and we wanted to encourage people to stop and look at these engines for themselves. So there were lab benches here, specially made, but then there were these stools which we got from a local tech, and we encouraged people to pull the stools out There are magnifying glasses on the desks, on the tables and the benches, and we allowed people to pick those up and look at the details on the locos. And also you can see here a copper boiler, some wheel castings and other bits. And as you went through the exhibition, there's other parts of locomotive all over them. This engine here was what in the middle here was one of Brian Goodchild's. It's a representation of Rocket. When I say representation, that's about as much as it is. It's got 4 wheels, a tall chimney, and it's called Rocket. But it is the locomotive as folk art. It's people making for the joy of making rather than the precision of it. The engine on the right here was made by a Nottingham lace maker, also a man at the prime of his career, but he sought relaxation and enjoyment making steam locomotive models out of the materials he had to hand. Not quite making them out of a coffee tin, but you know, he's doing it for the same reason, that he just wants to enjoy doing something. And we moved on through into a more industrial feel area, because these are the models that were made to either prove concepts or to try out ideas and see. So here in the middle, in the big copper reservoirs, is Arthur Parsley's compressed air locomotive, which he demonstrated to the Great Western Railway, and it didn't really work. In the case on the right, you can't really see it, but there is that very small twin cylinder model by the clockmaker that I showed you. Next to it is a timber model of a 4-wheel carriage made by William Headley, which is a wooden thing to prove that you could run the wheels coupled together. And then next to that is a thing called Salamanca, which is a model of Middleton Railway engine, Matthew Murray, really the first commercially successful steam locomotives in the world, but working on this rack and pinion basis. And you can see we have what's left of the rack and pinion wheel that was engaging alongside the main track that the engine ran on. But so we said about the Robson engine, the clockmaker's model being the oldest locomotive model, and then Salamanca here from Leeds Museums is the oldest model locomotive. So it's a model of a real locomotive. And I say it doesn't belong to us, it belongs to Leeds Museums, who we're very grateful that they let us have it. Some of the other incredible stories. This absolutely, for me, is one of the stars of the show that we had. When we first went to put the exhibition together, I'd never seen it. I didn't know about it. And but then I went to a talk one evening in Shildon, of all places, given by the Friends of the Stockton-Darlington Railway, and a gentleman, Dr. Tom Peacock, turned up with this, and he then proceeded to steam it up at the end of the presentation. Now, this has engraved in brass on the end plate of it, Thomas Greener, Etherley, 1836. Well, Etherley is about 3 miles from where I'm sitting, and Thomas Greener was an apprentice to Timothy Hackworth, who was the first locomotive superintendent on the Stockton-Darlington Railway. But Thomas Greener's father was an engineman on the Etherley incline. So the Stockton-Darlington Railway, I won't go back over the talk I gave you before, and I'm sure most of you won't remember it anyway, but the Stockton-Darlington Railway used stationary steam winding engines to pull the trucks over the hills before they got to Shildon, where the locomotive took the train away. And so it had a winding engine at the top of each hill. So there's one at Brustleton, which is about 1 mile from here, and then one at Etherley, which is 3 miles from here. And Thomas Greener's father, also Thomas, was the engineman on this winding engine. And so his son was apprenticed to Timothy Hackworth, and in 1836, Thomas Jr. built this engine. It runs on the hot bar principle, like we're saying about putting the bar in, but its current owner uses gas, and he's had the engine conserved. But it's not just about them, it's what happened. You know, Thomas Greener Jr. serves his time as an apprentice. Very sadly, his father is oiling up the full-size winding engine one day, and it's operating, and he's dragged into the motion, and he's killed. So Thomas Jr. becomes the breadwinner for the household, and therefore is determined to better himself than just be an engineman. So from these humble beginnings, Thomas Greener Jr. becomes a a wagon wright. He's building wagons and carriages in Darlington. He then becomes, I think, a coal merchant as well, and an entrepreneur of some sort, until there's a big crash in the 1880s and he finishes up bankrupt. But he pulls himself out of the ashes. He sold everything he has except for this engine, and he becomes a consulting engineer working out of Greenwich on railways until the end of his days. He has no family at the end of it, and this engine then passes through into the ownership of the family who have it now. But it is the oldest, I believe, the oldest working model steam engine in the world. Now, I got pulled up by saying that by some of the experts who were advising us, and they said, how can you say it's the oldest working model steam engine in the world? I've got older ones in my collection, and so have you. And I said, we may have older ones. I said, but this engine was in steam on October the 2nd, 2019. And in fact, it steamed again in October last year. So it's still in operation now. There is a small book about it and the family, which is fascinating. You can get that via the Friends of the Stockton Darlington Railway via their webpage, should you feel so inclined. It's about £10, and it's a really good read, because it actually embodies more about the story of this engine, not what it is in terms of a replica of a side lever winding engine, but what it meant to the family. You know, this was the founding of the family fortunes. But there we are, and it was a great link as well, because I went to my colleagues and I said, we've got this engine from Thomas Greener, and they said, oh yes, we've got his portrait in the museum. And of course, you know, one thing goes to another, because he ended his life as a consulting engineer, quite eminent of his time. He had his portrait painted, so we displayed the engine model alongside his picture and a quote from him, which was lovely. My other favourite, which we managed to put in, was this. And this is Invicta from the Canterbury and Whitstable Railway in Kent. I talked earlier about why people made models, and I talked about apprentice pieces. This is perhaps the ultimate apprentice piece. It was made in 1829 by a young man called Edward Fletcher. And Edward Fletcher was an apprentice at Robert Stevenson, 4th Street, Newcastle on Tyne, where they made the full-size Invicta. So he built this alongside the real Invicta. Invicta, if you've seen it in Canterbury Museum or now Whitstable Museum, bears little resemblance to this. But if you start looking at the drawings, you can see exactly how close this is. And this model has been used in a survey by Dr. Michael Bailey, looking at the origins and history and the engineering archaeology of Invicta itself. So even the colours are perfect. But William Fletcher went on. He delivered Invicta to the Canterbury and Whitstable. He rose to become their locomotive superintendent. And then after a number of years in the railway industry, I'll just scoot back to our friend's front room. By 1875, 1874, he designs this, the large 240 green locomotive at the front of the picture. So from an apprentice piece of Invicta, he rises through his career to progress to build something that is the cutting edge steam locomotive technology on the East Coast Main Line. But as a record, this is one of the models that our friend didn't want to lend to us. Because I said to him, I said, this engine's got such a fantastic story, I'd love to borrow it. And he said, you can't have it. I love it too much, now, especially now you've told me what it is. And we had such delays getting these Turkish models. And I said to him, John, I said, I know you said no, but what's the chance of it for 6 months? And he said, you can have it for York, but it's not going to London. And so we were very lucky to be able to show this engine in York with the full story attached. Now, I have to say, we only found out the story, the backstory to it, because painted on the underneath of it is a Science Museum inventory number, which we were then able to interrogate and find out that the Science Museum had borrowed it previously in 1929 for 6 months. So we were setting a precedent there. It's a lovely thing. It's been over the other side of the Atlantic and back, and hopefully it'll stay in the UK for good now. Topsy is another great story. This engine and the ones in the background. This is in where we were talking about selling ideas and concepts. So Topsy proves the narrow gauge railway to the world. It's made by Mr. Williams, the foreman of the Festiniog Railway's Boston Lodge Works, and his boss, Mr. Spooner, who was the engineer to the Festiniog Railway. And this ran on a figure-of-8 track around the front garden of Mr. Spooner. And whilst the large-scale engines on Festiniog were doing the business and wowing the dignitaries from Mexico, from Russia, and India, there is also an account of these guys all on their knees watching this thing running around the front garden. I think it's no small story to say that, you know, Topsy spread the concept of narrow gauge across the world just as much as the double fairley did. And in the background, you can see another couple of experimental engines. The one on the left, which looks like a glorified knitting machine on wheels, was made by Simon Goodrich, who was clerk to the Royal Dockyards in between 1800 and the 1820s, and he was corresponding with people like Trevithick and Watt and Stevenson and others, William Murdoch, and we have his letters, his correspondence in the museum collection, and you know, that engine was purely made to try all sorts of ideas out. It's got a spring balance on the boiler, it's got one kinked connecting rod, and it's an amazing thing. You know, Goodrich was never a railway engineer, but he was taken by the technology so much that he wanted to try things out. And then in the background on the right, the green engine is called Cosmo Bonser. It belongs to the Society of Modern Experimental Engineers, and it was built by a man called Jim Crebbin. Jim Crebbin was a clerk to the Bank of England. He was discouraged from model making by his parents because they saw it as a sign of weakness. I don't know why, but they did. And he built that engine there, Cosmo Bonser, to try out different firing methods. It's run on petrol, it's run on gas, it's run on coal. He tried out different wheel arrangements with it. You can see there, if you're into railways, it's a 460, so it's 6 wheels. It ran as what was called an Atlantic type, which meant it was a 442 at one stage. And Crebbin was up to so many things. He was friends with a number of major engineers on the railway, on the mainline railways. And we know on a number of occasions that Churchwood invited him to go and speak to apprentices at Swindon. And if you're into Great Western engines, you'll know the Great Western Kings have side control springs on the front bogies. And that was an idea that was attributed to Crebbin, although it was Collett that took it on rather than Churchwood. And that was something that came from Bob Meanley at Tyseley Locomotive Works. So, you know, this isn't us making things up, as some of the experts said that we were. We really did some superb research into this, and it was great fun. We did move it to London, and the feel was slightly different because we had to fit it into a gallery which it wasn't designed for. So instead of being one gallery where you walked all the way through, this was side by side, and you can see the lighting is very different. We've gone from quite light and airy to something that's dark, but we've still got this feel because this timber framing, we wanted to make it feel like a workshop, like something you might have at home potentially before moving into the industrial side of things. And there again is our little rocket friend, and the boiler and the castings and the lacemaker's engine. And there behind it is Thomas Greener on the wall in his portrait, a quote, and the Greener engine. And then to make again the differences, there's Topsy behind it. We had a bolt off a full-size locomotive, a fitted bolt from, I think it is actually from Scotsman. I was going to try and get through this evening without mentioning Flying Scotsman, but I failed. And we had that alongside a 2BA bolt, which was encased in resin, so that folks could see the absolute difference in scale, but the fact that the thing was doing the same job. Here's another apprentice piece. This was one of the Turkish engines we were able to bring out. This is Fire King. It was made in 1847 by Josiah Evans of Haydock in Lancashire, when he was an apprentice, based on a Great Western engine. By 1874, Josiah Evans is making locomotives for the Haydock collieries, full stop. If some of you are familiar with the engine Bellerophon, which is a 6-wheel tank engine which currently operates at Foxfield Railway, Josiah Evans made that. He also made beam engines and other machinery for the collieries too. But once again, this is his apprentice piece, and we very much enjoyed having it with us. It was a joy to have it. If we hadn't had COVID, we might have tried to reunite it with Bellerophon. There was a thought of having the two Josiah Evans engines together again. Together, full stop. But unfortunately, the world took a different plan to that. And we couldn't have these in York either because the time ran out for the fit out. But these are actually bits from my collection. We wanted to say about there being a burgeoning amount of literature. So there is the young engineer. This is the one that says about, be careful not to get oil on the cloth, otherwise you'll vex the maid. And then there's a couple of copies of the model engineer and amateur electrician, just to show the breadth of what the material that people were doing in the domestic environment. And then there's the super book that I have from the 1870s, the model steam engine, how to buy it, how to make it, and how to use it. I'm not entirely sure it would serve you hugely if you tried to use it in this day and age, but we've got to bear in mind that these were folks who were very, very practical. And whilst they hadn't necessarily got plans that they could buy from Reeves model engineers or Kenyans or whoever, they could look at something and make it work and make a concept work. And great to be able to show some of that material as well alongside the actual 3D objects. So yeah, this was one of the areas that I talked about before. You can see here the Robson engine with its twin cylinders. You can see the Headley carriage there, which is actually made out of wood, but is coupled together by gears. And so you put the twin cylinder machine on top of that undercarriage and it becomes Puffing Billy, which was William Headley's locomotive, as was Wylam Dilly, which then are only a hop, skip and a jump away from Salamanca. So the oldest locomotive model in the world alongside the oldest model locomotive, if that makes any slightly convoluted sense. Yes, we finished at York with Rocket. And people said, well, why have you got Rocket in a model exhibition? And I said, well, bear in mind that in the 19th century, nobody talked about scales. And you'll heard that I haven't said about anything being 5-inch gauge or 3.5-inch gauge or 15-inch gauge or 7 1/4, apart from the very first garden engine. And that's because people hadn't come up with the concept of an exact scale, pretty much. That only really starts to come in with Greenlee and Bassett-Loke and others. The 2.5-inch comes in and 3.5 and 5. So Rocket really is the ultimate one-to-one concept model. It's a full-scale model because Stephenson didn't have time to prototype the multi-tubular boiler. He didn't have time to prototype the direct-driven wheels from the cylinders. He didn't have time to try out the blast pipe on small models. He had to take a leap of faith and build Rocket to win the Rainhill trials as the ultimate concept model. So there we are. That's a very quick canter through a century of model making.